Frier Park has a way of meeting a person long before they ever see its roofline. Visitors describe the same peculiar sensation. As they approach the estate, something in the air becomes heavier, denser, almost expectant, as if the land itself knows it is about to reveal a story. Most grand houses rely on their owners for fame. Graceland has Elvis, Mount Vernon has Washington, Fallingwater has Frank Lloyd Wright. But Frier Park stands apart because it quietly became legendary long before a world-famous musician ever stepped across its threshold. When George Harrison eventually arrived here, he didn't elevate the house elevated him, and anyone who comes close enough understands why. Long before modern tourists heard the name Frier Park, gardening enthusiasts across Europe spoke of it with a kind of reverent curiosity. They whispered about its pathways that seemed to bend thought itself, about gardens that obeyed no single era or country, about illusions hidden in plain sight. These were not embellishments added by Harrison or by any modern curator. They were part of the estate's original design, a deliberate mosaic of beauty and mischief, constructed by someone whose imagination refused to stay within the boundaries of bricks and mortar. That early reputation, elusive, half-mythical, and strangely persistent, is what turned Frier Park into more than a house. It became a riddle. Even from a distance, the estate communicates its strangeness without uttering a word. A visitor walking the surrounding roads feels the shift first in the trees, the way their branches arc unnaturally toward the estate, the way the sunlight seems to fall differently near its borders, the way silence gathers as if waiting for a command. Nothing overtly supernatural, just a subtle orchestration of space, crafted to heighten awareness. A person instinctively slows down, breathes more carefully, and begins noticing details they would normally overlook. This is precisely the moment when the house takes hold, as many have put it, guiding the observer toward itself with an almost magnetic pull. And yet, the land on which Frier Park stands once looked no different from any other patch of countryside. Before the estate appeared, this was simply a pleasant stretch of fields near the River Thames, surrounded by other respectable Victorian homes that were built for comfort rather than legacy. Nothing suggested that this particular ground would one day hold a residence unlike any other in England, a place that would blur the boundaries between architecture and theater, between garden and imagination, between the world as it is and the world as one visionary man believed it could be. The earliest hints of the estate's unusual destiny came not from the soil, but from the mind that claimed it. When the future creator of Frier Park first walked these acres, he saw not rolling hills and scattered trees, but an opportunity to sculpt an entire universe, one where the visitor would never simply look at the surroundings, but would be drawn into an experience. Every slope could be shaped into a viewpoint, every hollow turned into a scene, every pathway designed to alter mood and expectation. The concept of the home was already changing across Europe, but here, on this quiet English ground, the idea of what a home could be was about to split open completely. The estate would not advertise itself with grandeur at first sight. Instead, it would lure the visitor step by step, revealing itself gradually, like a story told in layers. Before the first stone of the mansion was ever laid, before the gardens were carved into existence, before even the boundaries of the land were fully mapped, the identity of Frier Park had already formed, a house that controlled perspective, manipulated curiosity, and invited wonder. A house that, in time, would overshadow even the global fame of the man who would one day live within its walls. To truly understand why Frier Park became such a phenomenon, a place that appears in the memories of gardeners, historians, architects, musicians, and dreamers alike, one must return to its beginning, to the world of the late 1800s where ambition ran high and fortunes were built not only on industry, but on imagination, to the moment when a distinguished gentleman looked at an unremarkable English field and envisioned a realm where nature, illusion, humor, and architecture would coexist in ways no one had dared attempt. This is where the real story of Frier Park begins, not with the celebrity who later tended it, but with the vision that shaped it into a masterpiece long before he arrived. The origins of Frier Park lead us into a world where London was expanding at a furious pace, where railways stitched together distant towns, and where ambitious men sought not only influence, but permanence. Among them was Sir Frank Crisp, a sharp-minded lawyer whose success had carried him into the upper circles of Britain's industrial and scientific life. He spent his days drafting contracts for navies, oil companies, jewel magnates, and inventors shaping the modern age. Yet behind this discipline and precision lived a man with an imagination far too restless to be confined to ledgers and legal chambers. Crisp wanted a place where the mind could roam freely, where the strict geometry of his profession could dissolve into something playful, mysterious, and boundless. As London grew louder and more crowded, he began longing for a sanctuary, but not the kind that offered only rest. His vision aimed higher. He wanted an environment that felt alive, a landscape capable of telling stories, surprising its guests, and reflecting every facet of his interests. The traditional country estates of the era, even the grandest of them, were too predictable. They boasted manicured lawns and stately facades, but they rarely captured imagination. Crisp desired something different, something immersive, something that blended science, humor, artistry, and exploration into one seamless world. To create such a place, he needed land that offered both freedom and potential. And it was during his travels westward from London that he discovered Henley-on-Thames. At first glance it appeared serene, a riverside town framed by rolling hills, where the air smelled of water and wildflowers, and where the pace of life softened into something almost musical. But what caught Crisp's attention was not merely the scenery, it was the feeling that the landscape was already halfway to becoming a stage. The contours of the hills dictated natural pathways, the wooded valleys invited transformation, the open slopes promised dramatic viewpoints, and the silence, so rare near the capital, formed a canvas on which any world could be painted. The town itself was gaining recognition, especially after Prince Albert became patron of the famous rowing event on the Thames. It began shifting from quiet settlement to fashionable retreat, filled with villas and estates designed for weekend escapes. Yet Crisp saw something more than fashion. He noticed that Henley was close enough to London to remain connected, yet distant enough to feel untouched by the city's frenzy. It was a place where he could bring guests for elaborate gatherings, scientific demonstrations, or theatrical walks through gardens filled with illusions and riddles. Just as importantly, the land's natural rises and dips created endless possibilities for dramatic design, hills to carve into alpine scenes, valleys to transform into enchanted groves, and flat expanses to shape into gardens from entirely different cultures and periods. When Crisp began acquiring parcels of land just outside Henley, he wasn't simply planning an estate. He was laying the foundation for a world he could construct from the ground up. Each field, each slope, each cluster of trees became part of a developing mental map, a place where he could weave together his fascination with natural history, his delight in puzzles, his affection for humor, and his passion for landscape artistry. While other gentlemen sought houses that declared their wealth, Crisp sought a house that declared his imagination. As he walked those early acres for the first time, he didn't picture a single mansion standing alone. He imagined lodges that felt like enchanted cottages, pathways that bent thought toward wonder, lakes that played tricks on perception, gardens that transported visitors through continents and centuries, and a home perched proudly at the highest point, watching over a domain shaped by creativity rather than convention. In that moment, the idea of Frier Park was born, not as a residence, but as a realm, a place where the ordinary rules of landscape and architecture could be rewritten, and where the borders between reality and imagination could shift with every step. Sir Frank Crisp didn't just want a house in the countryside, he wanted a universe. And on the hills of Henley, he had finally found the one piece of earth capable of holding it. When Sir Frank Crisp formally began acquiring land on the outskirts of Henley, he wasn't gathering property in the casual way wealthy men often did. Each new acre he purchased was a fragment of a much larger vision, a piece of terrain he studied with the scrutiny of an engineer and the imagination of a storyteller. The land came in irregular shapes, some stretches wooded, others open, some rising sharply, others sinking into natural hollows. But Crisp saw them not as mismatched parcels, but as elements waiting to be unified into a single, breathing landscape. What would become Frier Park started as two neighboring estates, Frier's Field and Frier Park, each with its own modest house and private driveway. They were ordinary structures, neither remarkable nor aesthetically aligned with the world Crisp intended to create. Before designing anything new, he made a decisive choice. The existing buildings had to go. Their presence anchored the land to a past that had nothing to do with his dream. Crisp wanted a blank canvas, not an inherited story, but an authored one. And so, the old houses were dismantled, their stones and timbers carried away until only open ground remained. This act marked the symbolic beginning of Frier Park, the moment the land stopped being a collection of properties and became the raw material for a single unified creation. Once the terrain was cleared, Crisp faced the crucial step of choosing the people who would help transform his imagination into reality. England in the late 1800s was filled with talented architects and landscape designers, but Crisp sought someone capable not only of craftsmanship, but of interpretation. He needed collaborators who could understand a vision that blended humor with grandeur, precision with whimsy, and scientific curiosity with theatrical flair. This search led him to Henry Ernest Milner, one of the era's most respected landscape architects. A man known for his ability to choreograph movement through nature as fluidly as a composer arranges notes in a symphony. Crisp asked Milner not merely to design gardens, but to shape the entire approach to the estate. The first impression mattered deeply to him. He wanted visitors to feel anticipation build as they approached the house, to sense that they were entering a place constructed with intention in every detail. Milner responded with an ambitious plan. A driveway nearly a quarter of a mile long, sweeping upward from the southern gates toward the highest point of the land. It would not be a simple road, but a ceremonial ascent, a slow, deliberate transition from the outer world into the inner world Crisp envisioned. With the approach defined, the next challenge was understanding how the land should be engineered. The hills were beautiful but unpredictable, and Crisp wanted them sculpted without losing their natural drama. Workers began cutting terraces, redirecting slopes, establishing drainage, and marking spaces where future gardens and structures would stand. The early construction phase felt less like building a home and more like taming a vast living landscape. There were trenches to dig, hillsides to reinforce, paths to carve, and foundational stonework to lay long before the mansion itself could rise. During these early years, Crisp spent countless hours walking the grounds, watching workers reshape the terrain in accordance with Milner's plans and his own evolving ideas. He carried notebooks filled with sketches, measurements, and whimsical ideas, notes for features that would not be built for another decade. The estate was becoming something more than a place to live. It was becoming the project through which he expressed every corner of his imagination. The merging of Friar's Field and the original Frier Park into a single unified estate was not only a legal process, but an act of creative authorship. Roads were redirected, boundaries redrawn, and the land gradually began to take on the contours of a cohesive domain. For the first time, one could walk from the southern gate to the future location of the mansion and feel a sense of continuity, the early pulse of a planned world beginning to beat beneath the soil. As construction advanced, the land no longer looked like the outskirts of Henley. It looked like the foundation of something unprecedented, a place that was neither purely natural nor purely artificial, but a synthesis designed to spark wonder. Frier Park was not yet a house, not yet a garden, not yet a complete idea, but it had become unmistakably alive, shaped by the hands of hundreds of workers and guided by the mind of a man who wanted more than a residence. He wanted a realm. And for the first time, that realm was starting to emerge from the earth itself. The moment Sir Frank Crisp approved the first sketches of the estate's driveway, he understood that this single feature would define the emotional experience of every visitor long before they ever reached the house. He believed that the approach to a home should act as its overture, a gradual unveiling of mood and intention. A person should not simply arrive, they should be transported. And so, the quarter-mile ascent to Frier Park was conceived not as a roadway, but as a carefully staged performance in which the land itself would play the leading role. Milner, the landscape architect, studied the natural contours of the property with a precision more akin to choreography than engineering. The land sloped upward from the southeast gate toward the highest point of the estate, and Crisp immediately realized that this incline could create a psychological progression, each turn revealing just enough to spark curiosity. yet withholding the full view of the house until exactly the right moment. He wanted visitors to feel a sense of climbing into another world, as though leaving behind the familiar town of Henley and entering a domain governed by imagination rather than convention. Workers carved the driveway along a sweeping arc that followed the gentle rise of the hill. Instead of cutting a straight, efficient line to the mansion, they shaped a wandering yet deliberate route, one that guided the eye across layers of scenery. Trees were planted and cleared with equal intention. Certain clusters were left to create pockets of shadow, while others were removed to open windows onto distant slopes. The path widened and narrowed almost imperceptibly, building subtle tension. The earth itself seemed to participate in the illusion, rising beneath the wheels of carriages until the outside world felt further away with each passing yard. Crisp viewed the driveway not simply as a road, but as a kind of psychological corridor. He understood the power of delayed revelation. A guest entering through the tall brick gate piers would first notice the ornamentation, the carved figures, the mythical creatures, the playful faces peering down from stone, and immediately sensed that this estate was not bound by strict Victorian formality. But as soon as the carriage or horse proceeded forward, the gates disappeared from view, replaced by undulating stretches of greenery framing the path like the opening lines of a story. Milner's mastery of perspective ensured that the house itself remained hidden for most of the journey. It was positioned at the highest point of the estate, yet angled in such a way that hills and tree lines concealed its silhouette until the precise moment the approach was intended to climax. The driveway's final curve was engineered to create a dramatic reveal, the kind that makes even seasoned visitors catch their breath, as if seeing the mansion rise unexpectedly from the land itself. During construction, Crisp frequently stood along different points of the road, imagining how each guest would feel at that exact position. He selected vantage points that allowed glimpses of distant gardens, hints of lakes shimmering through branches, and occasional sightlines toward the expansive fields beyond the estate. All of it was meant to prepare the senses, subtly instructing the visitor that they were entering a place built to defy assumptions. Even the play of light mattered. Crisp timed the planting of trees so that morning sunshine would filter through in crisp, narrow beams, while evening light would spread softly across the slope in warm, golden layers. By the time workers completed the quarter-mile ascent, the driveway had become an artwork in motion. It manipulated anticipation with the skill of a stage illusionist, drawing guests deeper into Crisp's realm long before they glimpsed a single window or turret. Many visitors would later remark that the approach felt like walking through the prologue of a book, as if the estate itself was telling a story before any host ever spoke. And this was precisely the effect Crisp intended. Long before the mansion's walls were raised, long before the gardens were sculpted, the driveway served as the first completed promise of what Frier Park would become, a world in which space, perspective, and imagination worked together to enchant anyone who crossed its threshold. From the very beginning, Sir Frank Crisp understood that the entrance to his estate had to feel like a threshold between two worlds, the outside lane, the familiar countryside, the gentle hum of Henley. All of it needed to fall away the moment a visitor reached the gates. And so, the southern entrance to Frier Park became far more than a point of access. It became the estate's first guardian, its first storyteller, its first illusion. The tall red brick piers stood like sentinels, their stone bands catching the light in sharp, deliberate contrasts. Heavy iron gates hung between them, forged not just for function, but for drama. Yet what truly set these gates apart were the carvings perched on top and etched into their surfaces. Faces too expressive to be merely decorative, creatures too strange to be explained by any single mythology. Crisp had curated a small universe of symbols here, friars with exaggerated features, angels and devils placed side by side, winged serpents frozen mid-curl, dragons with open jaws, sphinxes that seemed to evaluate visitors as they passed beneath them. Even more unexpected were the carvings of reclining monks and grotesque faces with tongues extended in playful mockery, as if the estate itself were whispering, "Nothing here will be what you expect." These strange figures served a clear purpose. They unsettled, amused, intrigued, sometimes all within the same moment. Crisp wanted every guest to understand immediately that Frier Park was not a solemn Victorian domain, but a place where humor, eccentricity, and imagination worked in tandem. The effect was subtle, but undeniable. Before the visitor traveled even a single yard along the driveway, their mindset shifted. They were prepared to see the extraordinary. Just beyond the gates stood the lower lodge, a structure so elaborate that newcomers often mistook it for the main house. Built in the flamboyant Gothic style Crisp favored, the lodge rose from fiery red bricks, offset by pale stone dressings, its roof covered in richly patterned clay tiles. Arched windows, decorative gables, and intricate tracery gave it the appearance of a miniature manor, compact yet regal, ornate yet welcoming. Its scale suggested a supporting building, but its craftsmanship rivaled that of a grand residence. This was intentional. Crisp believed that wonder should begin immediately, not only at the mansion, but at the very start of the journey. The lodge served as home to the estate's head gardener and manager, Philip Oswin Knowles. Yet its architectural ambition far exceeded that practical function. Crisp famously ordered the building torn down and rebuilt at least once until it met his standards, signaling just how important this first impression was to him. The lodge needed to announce Frier Park's identity with confidence, a blend of fantasy, mastery, and carefully controlled illusion. Even the small sign beside the driveway offered a glimpse into Crisp's playful mind. It read, "Don't keep off the grass," leaving visitors momentarily confused. Was this permission, sarcasm, or a puzzle? Crisp delighted in such ambiguities. They prepared the visitor for the idea that meaning at Frier Park might be layered, that instructions might require interpretation, that humor might appear in unexpected corners of the estate. The combination of the gates, the symbolic carvings, and the lower lodge created a psychological threshold more powerful than any wall or fence. By the time a guest passed this point, they had already stepped into Crisp's imagination. The strange faces at the gates had challenged them to question what they saw. The lodge had dazzled them into curiosity. The atmosphere, thick with visual riddles, had shifted their expectations away from ordinary country living, and that was precisely the point. Crisp didn't want visitors to merely enter Frier Park. He wanted them to surrender to it, to feel watched not by threat, but by a whimsical intelligence woven into stone and symbol, to sense that the estate had its own personality, its own secret logic, its own playful guardians standing quietly at the threshold. The true mansion still lay far ahead, hidden beyond curves and trees. But already the estate had begun to speak. The visitor, without realizing it, had accepted the invitation to step deeper into a world where architecture and illusion intertwined, and where every structure, even the smallest, played its part in the unfolding story of Frier Park. Beyond the lower lodge, the estate began to unfold in a slow and deliberate rhythm, as though revealing its secrets in measured breaths. The driveway curved gently forward, but just beside it, hidden under the canopy of chestnut branches, lay one of the estate's earliest illusions, a place Sir Frank Crisp called Gloomy Glen. Visitors who dared to step off the main path found themselves descending into a dim, cool corridor of tangled roots and overhanging limbs. Leaves muffled sound, and daylight thinned into a muted green glaze. The air itself felt different here, as if filtered through the hush of forgotten stories. The path narrowed and twisted, guiding travelers deeper until the world above seemed far away. It was not sinister, but it carried the delicious tension of stepping into an unfamiliar chapter, a reminder that Frier Park was designed to be explored with curiosity, not haste. Emerging from this secluded hollow felt like stepping into another realm entirely, for just beyond the glen lay the alpine meadow, one of Crisp's earliest transformations of the land. Inspired by the sweeping visual theories of Capability Brown, Crisp had instructed workers to carve away entire sections of woodland to create an open valley that did not exist naturally. The resulting space looked effortless, a soft bowl of sunlight, where the breeze played across a carpet of carefully chosen wildflowers. But its creation had required immense labor. Crisp treated the terrain like a sculptor treats clay, removing what obscured the view, smoothing what distracted the eye, and shaping elevations so that each step revealed a new perspective. The meadow invited rest, yet whispered of something unusual beneath its quiet beauty, as though the earth had been reshaped with intention too precise to be accidental. From here, paths branched outward like veins of curiosity. Some hugged the contours of the land, leading gently upward. Others cut unexpectedly downward, becoming narrow passages between banks of moss-covered earth. Visitors often described the sensation of walking these trails as drifting through a dream, the terrain changing subtly, the atmosphere shifting with each turn, shadows deepening or dissolving, depending on the direction one chose. Crisp's goal was not merely to impress, it was to disorient in the most enchanting way. A person could feel entirely alone in one moment, then suddenly stand before a burst of open space or a newly revealed horizon. This early portion of the landscape established the language of Frier Park. Contrast, transition, and surprise. Crisp believed that a garden need not be static. It could tell stories. It could lead, mislead, and coax the visitor toward discovery. That philosophy manifested in small yet striking details. An unexpected cluster of stones arranged like a miniature geological puzzle, a hidden rise that offered a vantage point over distant fields, or the sudden appearance of water glistening through foliage just far enough away to draw the visitor onward. As the estate grew, these natural illusions served as a bridge to the far more ambitious creations Crisp had planned. The subtle tricks of light and shadow in the glen prepared one's mind for larger illusions to come. The sweeping openness of the alpine meadow taught visitors to expect grandeur in unexpected forms, and the winding paths, with their playful shifts in tone and scenery, hinted at the elaborate landscapes that would soon emerge, lakes that defied perception, gardens patterned after distant cultures, and mountains sculpted from stone and imagination. By the time a visitor left this early labyrinth of glens, meadows, and hidden passages, something essential had already changed. They arrived curious, now they were alert. Their senses were tuned to the estate's rhythm. They had learned, without being told, that Frier Park was not merely to be viewed, it was to be experienced, wandered, questioned, and occasionally surrendered to. And this was only the beginning. The land ahead held illusions far greater than these, illusions that would challenge perception itself, and transform the estate into a world where the boundaries between art and nature blurred effortlessly beneath the hand of Sir Frank Crisp. As the paths drifted away from the alpine meadow, the land began to open into a wide, shimmering expanse that seemed almost too perfect to be natural. Sunlight gathered on the surface of a long sheet of water, stretching out in a tranquil mirror that reflected trees, sky, and movement with nearly theatrical clarity. Visitors often assumed they had reached a single lake, peaceful and unified. But nothing at Frier Park was ever as simple as it first appeared. Sir Frank Crisp designed this part of the estate to test perception itself, and the result was one of his most captivating illusions. The lake system, though appearing seamless, was actually composed of 3 separate pools arranged in a stepped formation. Each pool sat slightly above the next, their edges disguised by stonework so precisely crafted that the boundaries vanished from a distance. Water spilled gently from tier to tier, creating the illusion of a continuous body. Yet the change in elevation made it possible to build features that would challenge even the sharpest observer. The stones placed along the upper pool were the key to one of Crisp's most famous tricks, the illusion of walking on water. Positioned just below the surface, the stepping stones blended into the reflective ripples so perfectly that anyone standing at the opposite end saw nothing but smooth, uninterrupted water. When a visitor began crossing the pool, their silhouette appeared to glide effortlessly across the surface, their feet hidden under the mirrored sheen. To an onlooker, it looked as though the lake had granted the traveler some impossible privilege, allowing them to cross without breaking the illusion of stillness. Crisp understood how deeply the eye desires simplicity, how readily the mind combines fragments into a single whole. The lake exploited this instinct, forcing observers to question not only what they saw, but how they interpreted it. For many guests, this moment marked their first true realization that Frier Park was designed to be more than decorative. It was built to awaken curiosity, to unsettle assumptions, to turn observation into a kind of game. The illusion was supported by an architectural innovation rarely seen in Victorian estates. Crisp commissioned artificial stonework created from a material called polyamite, an early and remarkably durable composite developed by James Pullum. This substance could be molded and textured to resemble natural rock with extraordinary precision, Crisp used it extensively around the lakes and waterfalls, blending genuine geological formations with crafted ones so seamlessly that even experts struggle to tell them apart. Steps, ledges, cascades, and outcroppings emerge from the landscape with the same confidence as naturally weathered cliffs. Polyamide allowed Crisp to control the terrain without revealing his hand, shaping the water's path, redirecting currents, and hiding supports for structures that contributed to the lake's illusions. One of these structures was the arched stone bridge that joined the narrow channel between the north and south pools. From afar it appeared ancient, as though it had survived centuries of shifting earth and river spray. Its stones rested in what seemed to be natural bedrock, worn smooth by time. Yet the bridge was entirely man-made, positioned to enhance the sense of age and permanence. Visitors crossing it often paused, feeling a strange blend of nostalgia and wonder, an instinctive belief that they were encountering something older than themselves, even though its origins were purely Victorian. Every detail around the water reinforced Crisp's commitment to storytelling. The trees encircling the lakes, blue spruces, towering pines, and fragile willows, were chosen not only for beauty, but for the shapes they cast on the water. Their reflections stretched and fractured in the ripples, adding to the sense that the lake was a living canvas rather than a static feature. In autumn, leaves drifting across the surface exaggerated the illusion of depth. In spring, blossoms settled gently over the tiered pools, hiding their edges even more effectively. Guests who explored this area often felt compelled to linger, watching the shifting patterns of light and shadow. Some said the lake felt peaceful, others described it as uncanny, but most agreed on one thing. It was impossible to approach without sensing that something mysterious lay beneath the surface, both literally and metaphorically. And indeed, beneath the tranquil film of water waited an even deeper illusion, one that would pull visitors into a world hidden entirely from view. The lake was not simply a stage for tricks of perception, it was a doorway. What began as a playful architectural puzzle would soon lead into a realm where Crisp's imagination grew far more daring, guiding guests away from sunlight and into the unknown, where the quiet ripples of the lake gave way to echoing stone chambers and flickers of pale blue light. The lake, in all its deceptive simplicity, was only a prelude to what lay below. Beneath the serene surface of the lake, hidden just beyond the reach of sunlight, Sir Frank Crisp constructed a world that startled even those who believed they had already grasped the estate's eccentricity. The tranquil pools above acted like a lid over a secret realm, one that could be reached only by rowing through a narrow, low opening in the stone. Most visitors noticed the entrance only when they were already drifting toward it. The contrast was dramatic. The bright shimmer of the lake faded as the boat crossed into darkness, the air cooling instantly, the ceiling dropping low enough that passengers instinctively leaned forward. The outside world slipped away behind them, as though sealed by the curtain of rock. As the boat crept deeper, the passage widened and the darkness began to glow. A soft, ethereal blue radiance illuminated the walls, mirroring the otherworldly beauty of the famous blue grotto of Capri. Crisp had studied descriptions and illustrations of the Italian wonder, and reimagined it through the lens of his own creativity. The gentle glow came not from sunlight refracted through water, as in Capri, but from hidden lighting ingeniously placed behind artificial stonework. The effect was mesmerizing. Ripples cast wavering shadows on the ceiling, and every drip of water from the rocky formations chimed softly in the quiet, creating an acoustic texture that felt both natural and deliberately orchestrated. Stalactites and stalagmites rose and descended in unpredictable formations, sculpted from polyamide and stone, arranged with such artistry that even geologists might pause before determining what was real. Crisp had a fascination with natural history, and saw these subterranean creations as a way to merge scientific curiosity with theatrical wonder. He wanted visitors to feel as though they had slipped into an ancient cavern untouched by human hands, only to realize, moments later, that the space carried the unmistakable imprint of human imagination. The tunnels branched into chambers, each with its own personality. One of the most peculiar was the vineyard cave, where the walls were covered in clusters of glass berries filled with small electric lights. They glimmered like phosphorescent gems, creating the illusion of bioluminescent vines growing in total darkness. This was no mere decoration. It was a symbol of Crisp's worldview, a celebration of blending nature, technology, and whimsy into one seamless act of storytelling. From there, the passage opened into a chamber that unsettled nearly everyone who entered, a cavern filled with the silhouettes of skeleton-like forms arranged as though frozen mid-motion. The shapes were crafted to evoke uncertainty, perhaps remnants of an explorer, perhaps playful exaggeration, perhaps something else entirely. Crisp never offered explanations. Part of his genius lay in leaving the line between humor and eeriness deliberately blurred, allowing each visitor's imagination to complete the scene in its own way. Even deeper inside lay the gnome chamber, one of Crisp's most famous creations. Rows of German garden gnomes, some whimsical, some solemn, some mischievous, were positioned in elaborate scenes, miners in the midst of work, musicians playing silent tunes, and communities engaged in mysterious activities. The chamber felt like a miniature world hidden within the earth, illuminated by soft, strategically placed lights. Visitors stepping into the room felt simultaneously amused and disoriented, especially when they noticed the reflecting mirrors tucked into the recesses. These mirrors distorted proportions in ways that made guests appear squat, rounded, and oddly gnome-like themselves. Crisp loved this trick. It allowed the viewer to become part of the scene, blurring the boundary between observer and participant. Hidden doors and internal staircases connected some of these caverns to the mansion above. Crisp designed these pathways not merely for convenience, but as part of a greater concept. The estate above ground and the world below, it belonged to the same narrative. They were complementary halves of one vast, unified idea. The house represented intellect, structure, and Victorian order, while the underground realm embodied imagination, mystery, and the playful subconscious. To move between them was to experience the full range of Crisp's vision. The subterranean world culminated in one final marvel, the ice grotto. Entered through a wooden door at the base of the alpine garden, the space dazzled visitors with its cool blue light, artificial icicles, and waterfalls that created frost in winter or chilled mist during warmer months. Crisp had recreated the icy caverns of Switzerland with astonishing accuracy, down to the texture of the stalactites and the subtle frost-like sheen on the walls. Hidden electric lights gave the grotto an otherworldly glow, transforming the chamber into an immersive illusion of perpetual winter. These caverns, grottos, and hidden passages were not merely indulgences. They were foundational to Crisp's philosophy of Frier Park as a complete world, not a house surrounded by land, but a universe layered above and below, connected through curiosity and exploration. Visitors who descended into the underground network returned to the surface changed. Their senses heightened, their expectations reshaped. They found themselves looking at the estate above with new awareness. The illusions beneath the earth prepared them for the architectural and botanical marvels still awaiting them in the open air, ensuring that each discovery at Frier Park resonated with depths both literal and imaginative. For Crisp, the underground realm was not an escape from reality, but an expansion of it. And for every guest who ventured into this shadowed theater of stone and light, the message became clear. At Frier Park, the extraordinary was not an exception. It was the rule. As visitors emerged from the cool shadows of the underground world, blinking back into daylight, the transition felt almost cinematic. The estate above ground did not simply resume where the caverns ended, it expanded. What awaited them was not a single garden, but a series of worlds, each shaped by a different era, a different culture, a different philosophy of beauty. Sir Frank Crisp had turned the land around his home into something resembling a living museum, a place where history, geography, and imagination intertwined so seamlessly that a stroll across a few acres could feel like a voyage through continents and centuries. The first major landscape to unfold before the visitor was the Japanese garden, a marvel of disciplined artistry and cultural respect. Crisp had based the design not on Western interpretations of Eastern gardens, but on an authentic illustration by Josiah Condor, one of the earliest Western experts on Japanese architecture and landscape design. As a result, the garden was not an imitation. It was a translation, crafted with such precision that it carried the quiet discipline and symbolic significance of its source. 5 undulating hills rose gently from the earth, placed in harmonious balance to reflect concepts central to Japanese garden tradition. Stones were selected and positioned with near-ceremonial care, some representing islands, others mountains, others forces of movement or stability. A waterfall spilled into a small basin with controlled grace, its sound engineered to blend seamlessly into the soft rustling of surrounding trees. Lanterns, bridges, and a tea house completed the scene, each placed with intentionality, not decoration. Visitors often remarked that walking through the Japanese garden felt as though one had stepped into a spiritual retreat, a complete shift in tempo, a surrender to balance and quietude. And just as the calm of Japan settled into the mind, the path lifted the visitor into an entirely different epoch. Crisp's fascination with medieval Europe materialized in a series of medieval gardens inspired by illustrated manuscripts from the 15th century. Raised beds bordered by timber or brick mirrored the agricultural aesthetics of the era, while trellises, arbors, and small pavilions recreated environments seen in ancient monastic drawings. Medicinal herbs and flowers, 34 varieties in each of the 2 main sections, were planted not for color, but for historical accuracy. These gardens formed a quiet contrast to the Japanese minimalism. They hummed with fragrance, texture, and a sense of human presence, as though monks or apothecaries might return at any moment to harvest their plants. Further along, Crisp introduced 2 gardens that became immediate favorites, the Gray Garden and the Blue Garden, each a monochromatic study in tone and mood. In the Gray Garden, foliage shimmered in muted silvers and frosted greens. Dusty miller, woolly lamb's ears, Japanese painted fern, and other varieties that seemed to catch and soften light. The result was a landscape that felt quiet, contemplative, almost lunar. In contrast, the Blue Garden pulsed with blossoms of every cool hue imaginable, hydrangeas tinted like sky and sea, star-shaped barrage flowers, clusters of hyacinths that carried a faint, sweet fragrance. Wandering from one garden to the next felt like moving through shifting emotional landscapes, each calibrated with its own palette. The path eventually widened into a radiant expanse filled with the perfume of hundreds of roses. The Rose Garden, one of Crisp's most sentimental creations. Tall pergolas wound with blooming vines created tunnels of color, while crimson ramblers and cascades of Dorothy Perkins roses framed the walkways in layers of red, pink, and blush. This was a garden designed not only for beauty, but for emotion. Its softness and romance balanced the architectural precision of other spaces, reminding visitors that Frier Park was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a place with heart. All of these gardens fed into the larger botanical collection surrounding the estate. Crisp's passion for natural history was reflected in the extraordinary range of species he cultivated. Beyond the designed gardens lay orchards, experimental beds, and carefully curated collections of plants arranged by origin or function. Each section offered a different lesson, some about geography, some about science, others about aesthetics or mythology. The result was an estate that read like an encyclopedia of world horticulture, not in cold pages, but in living, breathing color. What made these gardens extraordinary was not simply their beauty, but the way they transformed the perception of the house itself. The mansion stood at the center of these cultural worlds, like a scholar surrounded by books, absorbing, reflecting, and contextualizing their stories. The diversity of the landscapes suggested that the home belonged not to a single tradition, but to a broader intellectual curiosity that spanned cultures and centuries. Visitors began to see the house not just as a residence, but as a symbolic nucleus of ideas, a place from which imagination radiated outward in every direction. Through these shifting gardens, Crisp cultivated not only a landscape, but an identity. Frier Park became a haven for anyone willing to wander, observe, and be surprised. And as guests walked these paths, moving from Japan to medieval Europe to sweeping rose-covered avenues, they realized something profound. The estate was not a collection of scenes. It was a narrative, unfolding chapter by chapter, each garden contributing its own voice to a story too vast to be told by architecture alone. Here, the world gathered in a single place, not through monuments or artifacts, but through living landscapes shaped by a visionary hand, and the journey through those gardens was far from over, for ahead waited scenes that would push the boundaries of imagination even further. The path that wound past the themed gardens did not simply lead toward the house. It rose, ever so subtly, toward the most audacious dream Sir Frank Crisp ever imposed onto English soil. Visitors approaching from the eastern side would see it gradually emerge above the treetops, as though a fragment of the Swiss Alps had drifted across Europe and quietly settled in Henley-on-Thames. This was Crisp's Alpine Garden, the crown jewel of his landscape imagination, and at its summit stood something so improbable that guests frequently questioned whether they were seeing it correctly. A faithful miniature of the Matterhorn, complete with a snowy peak that glittered even in the warm months of June and July. The scale of the Alpine Garden defied expectation. Spread across nearly 3 acres, it rose almost 40 feet from its lowest paths to its highest summit. Real limestone, 7,000 tons of it, brought painstakingly from Yorkshire, formed the base of this artificial mountain range. Crisp blended those stones with polyamite formations sculpted to mimic rugged cliffs, crags, ledges, and crevices shaped by centuries of wind and ice. The result was staggering, an environment that looked as though it had existed long before the estate, carved by natural forces far beyond human hands. Yet every inch of it had been planned with scientific precision and artistic mischief. The ascent began gently. Narrow gravel paths curved around rocky outcrops, where alpine flowers emerged in brilliant clusters, edelweiss-like blooms, saxifrages, and countless other species capable of thriving in cool, well-drained soil. In shaded pockets tucked between boulders, delicate plants clung to the terrain as though surviving at high altitude. Crisp wanted the visitor to feel the gradual shift from garden to mountain, a sensation carefully engineered through temperature, sunlight, and vegetation. The higher one climbed, the more rugged the landscape became. Halfway up the slope, perched on a crag overlooking the lower estate, stood one of the Alpine Garden's most whimsical elements, a telescope aimed directly at a cluster of tin chamois positioned on a distant ridge. From ground level, these little mountain goats looked comically small, clearly artificial, but viewed through the telescope, the perspective transformed them into life-size creatures, tiny figures rendered convincingly real by distance and elevation. This optical trick delighted Crisp. To him, it represented the perfect fusion of humor, illusion, and the art of perception, Frier Park's signature trifecta. Further up the slope, a small Swiss chalet appeared, nestled at the mountain's base like a shelter for weary climbers. The structure offered shade in summer and a viewing terrace in cooler months. From its veranda, visitors could gaze across the entire lower estate, the shimmering lakes, the Japanese garden's curved silhouettes, the rose-laden pergolas, and the shadowed entrance to the caverns beneath. It was a vantage point that revealed the estate as a unified world, each feature visible from a single panoramic sweep. But the ascent was far from over. Higher still, hidden behind a cluster of rock formations, lay one of Crisp's most astonishing creations, the Ice Grotto. Entered through a modest wooden door set into the rock, it opened into a cavern crafted to feel like a hollowed-out glacier. Artificial stalactites glowed pale blue under concealed lighting, and icy textures coated the walls like frozen breath. Water from the garden's elaborate plumbing system dripped in steady, glistening threads, forming real icicles in winter and cool mist during warmer seasons. Visitors stepping into the grotto gasped not only at its beauty, but at the sudden drop in temperature. A carefully engineered illusion that made the experience eerily convincing. Above the ice grotto, the last portion of the ascent began. The path narrowed, forcing climbers to navigate steep switchbacks between jagged outcrops. Every twist revealed new angles of the estate below, views framed deliberately to evoke the sensation of standing on a true mountain ledge. Then, at the very top, the Matterhorn appeared, rising with its familiar pyramid shape, its peak dusted in brilliant white. Crisp had capped it with pulverized quartz, chosen specifically for the way it caught the sun and sparkled like fresh snow. On bright days, it gleamed so intensely that visitors shielded their eyes. At dusk, it glowed faintly with the last remnants of daylight. This moment, the first sight of the Matterhorn peak, was the climax not only of the Alpine garden, but of Crisp's entire landscape philosophy. It embodied everything he valued: craftsmanship, illusion, narrative, and a touch of delightful absurdity. It was a mountain built for no practical reason except that Crisp thought it should exist, and therefore it did. Nearby, arranged in niches and on small shelves carved into the stone, stood several garden gnomes, some cheerful, some solemn, all placed with the same precision as the boulders themselves. Crisp loved these figures and positioned them as silent witnesses along the ascent. They appeared unexpectedly around corners, peered from behind rocks, and stood in clustered groups as though observing travelers. Their presence created a sense of companionship on the climb, as though one had wandered into a mountain inhabited by small, enigmatic guardians. At the summit, visitors found a final viewing point where the wind felt cooler and the entire estate lay open below them, like an intricate map. From here, the mansion itself appeared not simply large, but regal, as though rising from the center of a mythic landscape that had grown around it in concentric rings of imagination. The Alpine garden was Crisp's boldest declaration, an insistence that landscape architecture could transcend the boundaries of style and become pure storytelling. It turned the estate into a theater of illusions, inviting each visitor to suspend disbelief and embrace wonder. And in doing so, it established Frier Park as a place where the extraordinary wasn't merely displayed. It was crafted, lived, and shared in every direction from the foot of the mountain to its glittering quartz peak. As the ascent down from the Alpine garden leveled out and the winding paths drew closer to the heart of the estate, the mansion finally revealed itself in full. Yet even in this moment of arrival, it felt less like a house and more like a being. Visitors approaching from the south often described the uncanny sensation that the home was watching them, not ominously, but attentively, as though it recognized each guest and held its own quiet expectations of how they might interpret the world they had just traveled through. The south facade, stretched across roughly 130 feet, rose like an elaborate tapestry woven from red brick and pale stone. It was flamboyant Gothic in its vocabulary, yet uniquely crisp in its expression, part medieval revival, part whimsical riddle, part architectural confession. Multiple cross-gabled roofs layered themselves like folded wings, each topped with clay tiles whose soft red tones echoed the hues of the surrounding gardens. Tall, slender chimneys rose in symmetrical trios, their brickwork patterned with colored bands and crowned with intricate terracotta pots. These chimneys gave the impression that the house exhaled warmth and intelligence, as though its fires burned not merely for comfort, but for contemplation. On the right side of the facade, a polygonal bay emerged like a quiet guardian tower. It rose from the ground in stages, first a cluster of windows framed by carved stone, then a narrow balcony, then a steep pyramidal roof topped with a copper finial. Light struck this finial at different times of day, making it glow like a watchful eye that tracked the movement of the sun. On the opposite side, another turret mirrored the first, but took a more martial form. Octagonal, with indented battlement-like details that suggested a playful nod to fortress architecture. Crisp enjoyed such references, not because the estate needed defense, but because symbolism mattered deeply to him. Every form, every carving, every shadow had a purpose. Beneath these towers, the main entry projected dramatically from the facade, framed by an arch of richly carved stone. 6 reptilian gargoyles crouched above it, their stony faces frozen mid-snarl. They were not threatening. Their exaggerated features gave them an almost comedic flair. Yet they served their symbolic role faithfully, announcing that the threshold ahead marked a boundary between worlds. Gargoyles historically protected buildings from evil spirits, but Crisp, ever playful, seemed more interested in protecting visitors from taking themselves too seriously. The entry arch itself carried a chronogram revealing the year 1895, the first year the mansion was occupied. Crisp added inscriptions here written in both Latin and English, some solemn, others humorous, all deliberately ambiguous. One motto encouraged guests to enter in peace and depart merrily, while another cautioned that the tales one shares may contain more than one intends. These words, carved with care, were not mere decoration. They functioned like the literary preface to an elaborate book, signaling the philosophy embedded in the home. that truth, perception, and experience are never singular. Across the facade, hidden inscriptions blended almost invisibly into the ornamentation. Some were fragments of poetry, others cryptic riddles, and a few were puzzles devised by Crisp himself. They were positioned so subtly that many visitors passed them without noticing, but those with sharper eyes found themselves rewarded with small revelations. One stone panel displayed an encrypted phrase whose meaning changed depending on the angle from which it was read. Another embedded symbolic creatures in its carvings, forming a visual sequence that hinted at a moral lesson. Crisp seemed to delight in the idea that the house could hold private conversations with those willing to look closely. The terrace garden, stretching out before the mansion, amplified these themes. Carved in formal Dutch scrollwork, its knot patterns reflected the complexity of the mansion's facade, not symmetrical, but harmonious. It was as though the garden mirrored the building's inner logic, order wrapped around imagination, structure softened by flourish. At the far end stood the fountain of perpetual mirth, adorned with playful figures Crisp had once arranged to amuse his guests. The sound of water drifting upward from the fountain added a musical backdrop to the facade, a reminder that joy and elegance were not mutually exclusive in this estate. They were intertwined. Yet the most striking quality of the mansion's exterior was not its ornamentation, but its awareness. The arrangement of windows, tall, narrow, framed with stone mullions, gave the impression of watchfulness. The square tower rising 4 stories high, capped with a pyramidal roof punctured by attic windows, seemed like the estate's observatory. It provided sweeping views over the gardens below, but symbolically, it also extended the house's presence across its domain. From this vantage point, the mansion appeared not only as the final destination of the visitor's journey, but as the mind from which all the surrounding illusions originated. Crisp had designed the exterior as a narrative gateway, where symbols acted as the alphabet, and architecture served as the grammar of a living story. The house did not merely contain the world of Frier Park. It explained it, interpreted it, and completed it. Standing before the south facade, a visitor sensed that the entire estate radiated outward from this point, each garden and grotto an extension of the same grand philosophy. And with that shift in perspective, the journey finally moved inward, toward halls, staircases, and chambers where the mansion revealed not just its beauty, but its intellect. Crossing the threshold into Frier Park felt like stepping from a grand theater into its backstage realm, where every illusion was revealed not with explanation, but with deeper layers of enchantment. The air inside carried the faint scent of polished oak and cool stone, and the first impression was not of domestic comfort, but of ceremony, as though the house demanded a moment of quiet acknowledgement before allowing guests to explore its depths. The entrance vestibule, long and narrow, framed the journey forward like a prologue carved in marble. Beneath one's feet, inscriptions set into the tiles offered cryptic reminders about discretion and perception. They were not moral warnings nor mere decorations, but invitations to adopt a particular state of mind, a mix of curiosity and humility. On the walls, carved stone friars tugged on ropes in comedic struggle, their expressions locked in animated effort. These were the first of many such figures hidden throughout the house, humorous guardians who turned everyday features into visual riddles. The doorbell itself was activated by pressing a piece of malachite held between the teeth of a carved monk's head, a detail so unexpected that visitors often paused in delighted confusion before using it. Stepping deeper into the mansion, the house suddenly unfolded into one of its most commanding spaces, the Jacobean Hall, a 37-foot-high chamber that rose like a cathedral of oak and light. Vast panels of richly carved wood lined the walls, each bearing intricate patterns that seemed to shift depending on where one stood. The ceiling soared upward into shadows, its beams arranged with near-geometric precision. At the far end stood a colossal fireplace, 20 feet tall, framed by stone panels depicting lines from Tennyson's "Ring Out Wild Bells." The verses, carved with solemn grace, echoed Crisp's reverence for poetry, wisdom, and the passage of time. Yet even here, amid grandeur, humor lingered at the edges. Light fixtures shaped like fantastical creatures extended from the walls, casting whimsical silhouettes across the floor. The staircase ascending from the hall wound upward in polished oak, its balustrades alive with carvings of foliage, serpents, and mythical beasts. Crisp understood that stairs are not merely functional structures, but transitional spaces where anticipation gathers. Each step offered a shifting angle on the hall below, heightening the sense of ritual. At the top, a long gallery extended toward the upper rooms, lined with doors of varying sizes. Some real, some decorative, some hiding small passages used by servants, and at least one leading to the hidden stair descending into the alpine caves below. The mansion's library and study, positioned along the southeast side, boasted tall windows that gazed out over the slopes of the estate. Here, the sun fell in precise patterns across the shelves, illuminating books on science, natural history, law, and botany. Crisp often worked at a desk, placed strategically between two windows, allowing him to oversee both the intellectual heart of his home and the landscape he had shaped. The library's atmosphere carried the quiet gravity of a scholar's sanctuary, yet even here Crisp allowed touches of lightness. A carved owl with a mischievous tilt to its head, or a shelf supported by brackets shaped like dragons curled protectively beneath the wood. Moving onward, visitors entered the dining room, a richly beamed chamber where oak columns supported carved figures and sculptural motifs. Built-in seating flanked the fireplace, creating alcoves that encouraged long, unhurried conversation. A sense of medieval warmth permeated the room. Shadows played along the beams, and the stonework seemed to glow under lamplight. The room's proportions, perfectly balanced, created an acoustic effect in which voices carried softly without echo, a detail Crisp had insisted upon. Beyond the dining room, satinwood doors opened into what had once been the mansion's ballroom, now used as a pair of drawing rooms. Their ceilings were painted like a summer sky, with pale clouds drifting above garlands of honeysuckle. Small birds appeared perched within the painted branches, subtle touches that rewarded those who looked upward. In the corners, cherubs added an air of playful grandeur. The room seemed to breathe with light, its tall windows capturing the shifting moods of day, transforming the space into a luminous retreat at dawn and a golden hall at sunset. And then there were the surprises, Crisp's signature inventions that gave the home its unforgettable personality. Light switches shaped like friar faces, where pulling a nose or tipping a head would illuminate the room, hidden doors disguised as panels of wainscoting, leading to private passages or storage spaces. Windows with stained glass crafted by Edward Burne-Jones, casting jewel-toned patterns onto the floors. Every chamber seemed to offer something unseen at first glance, something that revealed itself only to those who lingered. Even the floors contributed to the sense of enchantment. Mosaics of colored tile appeared in unexpected corners, offering intricate patterns reminiscent of ancient cloisters. Marble slabs in the hallways reflected faint shadows of passing figures, creating illusions of movement that Crisp surely enjoyed. Every material, wood, stone, glass, metal, served not only a functional purpose, but a narrative one. They told a story of craftsmanship, intellect, humor, and the interplay between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Inside Frier Park, time behaved differently. The mansion absorbed visitors into its rhythm, guiding them through grand halls, intimate chambers, and curious corners that seemed designed to spark questions rather than provide answers. Crisp had succeeded in creating an interior world that stood in perfect dialogue with the gardens outside, structured yet whimsical, dignified yet playful, scholarly yet enchanted. Here, within these walls, the true personality of the estate revealed itself, and as guests continued deeper into the mansion, they sensed that every hallway, every staircase, every carved face was preparing them for an experience that merged fantasy with function. A home that thought, observed, and invited exploration at every turn. To understand Frier Park as a living, breathing world, one must look past its stones, gardens, and illusions and turn toward the mind that conceived it. The mansion, with all its eccentricities and hidden delights, did not simply reflect Sir Frank Crisp. It was Sir Frank Crisp. Every corner of the estate carried his fingerprints, not in a literal sense, but in spirit. The humor woven into the gargoyles, the intellectual puzzles embedded in inscriptions, the playful tricks of perspective, the botanical experiments, the subterranean fantasies, the elaborate landscapes mimicking faraway countries. It was as if Crisp had used the land the way a writer uses paper, filling it with ideas until it became an autobiography written in architecture and earth. Crisp was a man of formidable intellect, someone whose legal brilliance placed him among the most influential figures of his era. Yet, alongside that sharp, analytical mind, lived an imaginative force, curious, restless, mischievous. He loved science and structure, but equally adored whimsy. He respected logic, yet delighted in bending perception just enough to make a visitor question their assumptions. This duality shaped his identity, and in turn, shaped the identity of Frier Park. It was not just a home for him. It was a medium, a canvas on which he could express the full breadth of his personality. His fascination with illusions is perhaps the clearest example. Crisp did not use illusions as cheap tricks or decorations. He used them as philosophical statements. The lake that allowed people to appear as if they were walking on water, the hidden viewpoints framing the estate with deliberate artistry, the distortive mirrors in the caves, the telescope aimed at miniature chamois. All of these elements nudged visitors to rethink the reliability of their senses. In Crisp's world, nothing was simply what it appeared to be. Reality had layers, each waiting to be uncovered by those willing to look a little closer. This love for the unexpected extended to his sense of humor, which infused the estate with warmth. Carved faces with exaggerated expressions, playful mottos hidden in stone scrolls, monks engaged in perpetual tug-of-war, light switches disguised as friars' noses. These details revealed a personality unwilling to treat grandeur with too much seriousness. Crisp admired the traditions of Victorian architecture, but he refused to be restrained by its stiffness. Instead, he infused his estate with a joyful irreverence, reminding everyone who entered that curiosity and humor could coexist with elegance. Equally influential was his passion for collecting. Crisp did not collect objects for prestige. He collected stories, garden gnomes, sundials, rare plants, botanical specimens, illustrated manuscripts. These were not trophies, but ingredients. He blended them into the estate much as a composer blends instruments into symphonies. A visitor wandering through his gardens encountered not just flora, but chapters from history, geography, mythology, science, and art. His collections became teaching tools, conversation starters, and invitations to explore. Crisp's interest in puzzles and riddles shaped the house itself into a labyrinth of ideas, the inscriptions etched above doorways, the hidden references to literature, the Latin mottos with double meanings. These were intellectual breadcrumbs. He wanted guests to think, to question, to decode. In this way, the estate became a game, one played not with rules, but with discovery. Walking through Frier Park felt like solving a mystery in which the answer was not a single revelation, but the realization that exploration was the reward. Yet beneath all the humor and eccentricity lay a profound respect for craftsmanship and meaning. Crisp was not a man who improvised carelessly. Every stone in the Alpine garden, every carving on the facade, every mechanical system in the caves was placed with intention. He believed that beauty came from attention to detail, and that even the most whimsical idea deserved impeccable execution. This seriousness of craft elevated the estate from quirky oddity to masterpiece. It ensured that the illusions delighted rather than distracted, that the humor charmed rather than cheapened, and that the house felt not chaotic, but symphonic. The most fascinating aspect, however, was how Crisp's personality gave the estate a kind of soul. For many visitors, Frier Park feels alive, not haunted but aware, as if the landscape responds to the curiosity it inspires. This awareness is a reflection of its creator. Crisp poured so much of himself into the estate that it became an extension of his identity. The gardens breathe with his fascination for the natural world. The illusions carry his curiosity. The architecture bears his intellect. The humor echoes his voice. Even the hidden paths feel like invitations from him personally, encouraging guests to venture deeper and discover more. Long after Crisp's era passed, this presence endured. Visitors who never knew him still felt his hand guiding their steps, lingering in every carved detail and every playful surprise. The house did not simply outlive him, it continued to express him. And so, Frier Park became something few estates ever achieve, a personality in its own right. A place where the landscape thinks, where the walls laugh softly, where the ground tells stories, and where the spirit of its creator still walks alongside every guest who dares to follow the winding paths. This mysterious, brilliant master shaped the estate, but in time, the estate shaped him as well, immortalizing his curiosity and imagination in every stone and shadow. After Sir Frank Crisp's departure from the world he so meticulously crafted, Frier Park entered a new chapter, one defined not by creation, but by endurance. Without its architect, the estate stood at a crossroads. A place built with such precision, whimsy, and philosophical depth could not simply be maintained by routine caretaking. It needed a steward who understood not just its structure, but its character. Yet life after Crisp unfolded in gradual steps rather than radiant discoveries. The estate changed hands, families came and went, and the gardens, once tended with near devotional attention, began to soften around the edges. The Alpine garden lost a little of its crisp geometry, though its stones remained as stoic as ever. Trees grew unruly around the lakes, casting shadows that altered the delicate illusions Crisp had embedded in their surfaces. The medieval beds faded into simpler arrangements. Some mechanisms in the caverns slowed or ceased their quiet performances. But while time inevitably left the marks, it never managed to erase the estate's inner essence. Crisp had built Frier Park too intelligently, too lovingly, for its spirit to dissolve. Even when certain features weathered or certain details dimmed, the logic of the estate, the interplay of humor, grandeur, and mystery remained intact. Visitors during these transitional years often noted the same phenomenon. The house still felt inhabited by its creator's mind. The gargoyles still watched with sly amusement. The inscriptions still whispered their enigmatic advice. The winding pathways still redirected steps toward wonder rather than monotony. Frier Park seemed to protect itself, preserving its atmosphere even when practical maintenance faltered. The house behaved like an organism that refused to surrender its identity, holding its breath through uncertain years, as if waiting for someone who could hear it clearly again. That someone arrived in 1970. When George Harrison purchased Frier Park, the world knew him as a musician, a Beatle, a cultural icon. But the estate recognized something else: a gentleness, a spiritual curiosity, a reverence for nature, and an appreciation for spaces that shape the mind. Harrison did not come seeking a trophy property. He came seeking refuge and found a world that mirrored parts of himself he had not yet fully articulated. Unlike previous transitional owners, Harrison understood immediately that Frier Park was not simply a house to occupy, but a place to befriend. He approached the estate not with the authority of a new master, but with the humility of a caretaker stepping into an ancient lineage. He walked the grounds slowly, absorbing the rhythms Crisp had built. He studied the gardens, the architecture, the illusions, the playful symbols. And then, quietly, lovingly, he began giving the estate the attention it had been waiting for. One of his first missions was restoration. He cleared overgrown pathways, repaired crumbling stonework, reactivated long-dormant mechanisms, and reopened views that had been obscured by decades of shifting growth. He treated the gardens with respect, nurturing their diversity rather than redesigning them. He honored the Alpine garden's drama, the Japanese garden's tranquility, the medieval garden's precision. Under his stewardship, the estate began breathing again. Inside the mansion, Harrison restored the warmth of the great halls, returning glow to the oak panels and reviving rooms that had fallen into quiet disuse. He filled the home not with ostentation, but with music, family, and the radiance of simple living. The house responded. The marble floors regained their shine. The stained glass sang once more in the changing light. Even the whimsical details, the friar-faced switches, the mirrored illusions, seemed to spark back to life, as though amused to be noticed again. Perhaps Harrison's most symbolic act of restoration was the return of the gnomes. Over time, many of Crisp's beloved figures had been scattered or lost. Harrison tracked them down, sometimes piece by piece, story by story, and brought them home. He placed them not randomly, but thoughtfully, ensuring they continued their timeless roles as playful guardians of the estate. In doing so, he revived a part of Crisp's humor, stitching the past and present together with gentle precision. Harrison also infused the estate with new life through music. Frier Park became a creative sanctuary, a space where songs were born, albums shaped, and artistic friendships nurtured. Yet even in creativity, Harrison remained aligned with the estate's spirit. He treated the house and gardens not as a studio backdrop, but as collaborators in the quiet pursuit of inspiration. By the time Harrison's family grew into the home, Frier Park had fully awakened. The illusions shimmered again. The gardens breathed in tune with the seasons. The underground caverns echoed softly with wonder. The estate had found a new guardian, a man who, like Crisp, understood that beauty required care, patience, and imagination. In the gentle passing of years, something extraordinary happened. Crisp's world and Harrison's world became one. Two men separated by time shared a single vision through the estate they loved. They both saw Frier Park not as a monument, but as a living companion, an entity deserving respect, curiosity, and affection. And so, the estate endures, not simply because it was built well, but because it has been understood. Its story is carried forward by those who choose to listen. Frier Park is alive because it has always attracted caretakers rather than conquerors, people who sense, consciously or not, that they are meant to protect its delicate fusion of imagination and reality. As dusk settles over the terraces and the last rays of sunlight catch the copper finials and the quartz peak of the miniature Matterhorn, the estate seems to exhale, a quiet acknowledgement that its spirit remains intact. The world changes, generations turn, but Frier Park continues to thrive through the guardians who keep its wonder alive.